The end did not come with a bang, but with a hum, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the world's very bones. Dr. Eris Thorne felt it first in the deep stacks of the Metropolitan Archives, a vibration that ran up through the concrete floor and into the soles of her worn leather shoes. It was a subtle thing, easily dismissed as a passing subway train or distant construction. Yet it persisted, a constant subliminal thrum that set her teeth on edge for 3 days. The hum was the only omen. The world outside the archive's thick, climate-controlled walls continued its frantic rhythm, but Eris, a woman who had dedicated her life to the patient study of humanity's past, felt a discordant note in its present. She was a historian of forgotten conflicts, an expert in the desperate and very asymmetrical wars that never made the grander textbooks, the ones fought in muddy trenches and shadowed alleys by people with nothing left to lose. Her specialty was the human capacity for savage resilience, and she could feel the prelude to a new chapter in the very air she breathed. On the 4th day, the sky began to change. It wasn't the sudden, brutal eclipse of a mothership blotting out the sun, but a slow, opalescent bleed. The familiar blue of the afternoon began to shimmer with prismatic colors, as if an oil slick had been smeared across the upper atmosphere. People stopped on the streets, their cell phones held aloft, capturing images of the beautiful, unsettling phenomenon. News reports were a confused flurry of scientific speculation, solar flares, atmospheric ice crystals, some unprecedented meteorological event. Iris watched from her office window, the city's awestruck silence more terrifying than any panic. It was the silence of a flock of sheep gazing at a beautiful, silent wolf. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that this was not a natural event. This was an arrival. The invaders, if they could be called that, were never seen. They had no name because they never introduced themselves. They were simply a process, an inexorable force that began to rewrite the world with the dispassionate precision of a master architect. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate, and they did not destroy. They corrected. The hum intensified, and with it, the transformation began. It started at the edges of the city, at the sprawling industrial parks and concrete plains of the suburbs. The metal of warehouses began to flow like liquid mercury, pulling itself into delicate, crystalline lattices that glittered in the strange new light. Asphalt softened and reformed into smooth, obsidian pathways. It was terrifyingly beautiful, a geometric plague consuming the familiar chaos of human civilization and replacing it with something silent, perfect, and utterly alien. There was no violence, no overt aggression. Military jets that scrambled to investigate simply fell from the sky, their engines choked by crystalline growths that blossomed across their fuselages in seconds. Tanks that rolled into the transformation zones were becalmed, their steel hulls absorbed and integrated into the growing alien structures. The architects, as the few remaining broadcast voices began to call them, did not fight. They simply assimilated from the fortified safety of the archives. Eris watched the world dissolve. The building, a fortress of granite and steel built to withstand time itself, seemed to resist the change for now. Power grids failed, but the archive's generators kicked in. Water stopped flowing, but its independent cisterns held firm. The internet collapsed into fragmented, screaming pockets of terror before it too went silent. Eris and a handful of others, the skeleton crew of archivists, security guards, and engineers who had been on duty when the city was cut off were marooned in a stone island amid a sea of terrifying change. For 2 weeks, they subsisted on emergency rations and fear, watching through reinforced windows as the city outside their walls was reborn. The true horror was not revealed until the architects turned their attention from inanimate matter to the biological. Eris witnessed it from a rooftop surveillance camera feed, the grainy black and white image forever burned into her memory. A small group of survivors was huddled in a park that had not yet been fully transformed. They weren't attacked. There were no plasma bolts or menacing war machines. A fine, shimmering dust, like pollen made of ground glass, drifted down from the prismatic sky. It settled on their skin, their hair, their clothes. At first, nothing happened. Then, one of them, a young woman, stopped moving. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted as if listening to the omnipresent hum. Slowly, a crystalline sheen crept over her skin, hardening her features into a translucent mask. Her flesh lost its color, becoming as clear as glass, revealing the intricate network of veins and organs beneath. Then, even that internal structure began to change. Her bones elongated and fused. Her organs dissolved into a slurry of shimmering liquid that was drawn up into the growing crystalline matrix. Within minutes, she was no longer a person. She was a statue, a flawless, human-shaped crystal that pulsed with a faint, internal light, an integral part of the new landscape. The rest of her group did not even have time to scream before the same silent, beautiful consumption took them. Eris stumbled back from the monitor, a strangled cry caught in her throat. This was their purpose. They weren't conquerors. They were harvesters. Humanity wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was an inefficient biological resource to be optimized. They were being turned into architecture, the hope for rescue, for some last-ditch military response from an outside world, died in that moment. There was no one coming. The world was being methodically, impassively unmade. In the terrified silence that followed, a new feeling began to curdle in Aris's gut, pushing past the horror and despair. It was a cold, academic fury. She had spent her life studying the moments when humanity was pushed to the brink, when civilizations faced forces that seemed destined to erase them. The Romans at Cannae, the Aztecs facing Cortez, the partisans in the forests of Belarus. In every case, when faced with extinction, a cornered and desperate humanity had found a way to fight back, not with honor or valor, but with a savagery that shocked its would-be conquerors. The architects saw humanity as flawed, chaotic material. Eris decided, in that moment, that she would show them just how flawed and chaotic it could be. She found the others in the archive's main reading room, their faces pale and drawn. There was Kale, a hulking sanitation engineer who had been doing contract work in the sub-basements when the city was sealed. His knowledge was not of books, but of the city's hidden veins, the sewer lines, steam tunnels, and forgotten subway passages that formed a labyrinth beneath the streets. There was Lena, a cynical network technician who had kept their internal systems running. She saw the world in lines of code and signal pathways, and she had watched the architect's influence spread like a virus through the global digital network before it all went dark. And there was Marcus, the archive's head of security, a man whose rigid adherence to protocol had been shattered, leaving behind only a grim, protective instinct. They are turning people into glass, Eris said, her voice raw but steady. They're not killing us. They're harvesting us. We're a resource, like iron ore or timber. The stark, biological horror of it settled over them. Marcus stared at his hands, as if expecting to see the crystalline sheen begin to form. "So what do we do?" he whispered. "We can't fight that. What can a gun do against a cloud of dust? You're right," Eris said, her mind racing, connecting disparate threads of history, pulling tactics from long-dead insurgencies. "We can't fight them, not in the way you think. An army fights another army. A soldier shoots another soldier. This isn't a war. This is an infestation. And what do you do with an infestation? You don't fight it. You poison it. You burn it out. You become a disease in their perfect system." Lena looked up, a flicker of interest in her tired eyes. "What are you talking about? They see us as a building material," Eris explained, pacing now, the energy of 1,000 forgotten rebellions flowing through her. Uniform, predictable. They've analyzed our biology, our chemistry, and they are converting it. But they've only analyzed us in our civilized state. They haven't seen us when we're cornered. They've mistaken our society for our nature. Our nature is something else entirely. She turned to Kyle. "You know the tunnels under this city, don't you? The places no one has seen in 100 years. Kyle nodded slowly. "Better than my own home. The whole city's built on layers. Old water mains, gas lines, subway tracks. A mess." "Good," Eris said. "A mess is what we need. The architects are building a perfect, orderly world on top of our chaotic one. They're building on a rotten foundation. We're not going to fight their structures. We're going to attack their process. We are going to introduce impurities. We will become the flaw in their design, the grit in their machine." The idea was insane. A desperate academic theory hurled against a cosmic, world-ending force. But it was better than sitting here and waiting to be turned into a garden ornament. Their first target was a conversion hub they had identified from the surveillance feeds. A former city plaza where the crystal dust was thickest and the process of assimilation was happening most efficiently. Getting there would be a death sentence on the surface. But Kyle, after studying old city blueprints from the archives, found a way. A series of long-abandoned sewer lines and maintenance tunnels snaked its way directly beneath the plaza. Their journey was a descent into a forgotten world. They moved through suffocating darkness, the air thick with the smell of decay and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, silent world being built above. Kyle led them with an uncanny sense of direction, his heavy footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Lena had jury-rigged a short-range scanner from server parts, its screen showing the intense energy readings from the conversion process directly above them. They found what they were looking for at a junction point where a massive, century-old water main passed beneath the plaza. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the cast-iron pipe. According to Lena's readings, the architects were drawing vast amounts of energy from the planet's geothermal core, channeling it through the very ground to power the conversion. Their plan was simple, born of Eris's historical research into scorched earth tactics. It wasn't about destruction. It was about contamination. They didn't have explosives, but the Archives Preservation Department had something else, gallons of highly corrosive chemical compounds used for restoring ancient, decaying celluloid film. The stuff was a chemical nightmare, designed to eat through organic material. To the architect's perfect, orderly process, it would be a poison. Under Kale's guidance, they used a manual drill to breach the ancient water main, the screech of metal on metal grating on their nerves. The pipe was dry, having been disconnected from the city's grid for decades. Pushing further, they drilled through the concrete foundation separating the tunnel from the ground above. As the drill bit broke through, a wave of energy washed over them, and the fine crystalline dust began to pour into the tunnel. Now Eris yelled over the hum, working quickly. They fed a hose into the opening and began pumping the corrosive chemicals up into the soil of the plaza. For a long, terrifying minute, nothing happened. The hum continued. The dust poured down. They had failed. Then, the quality of the hum began to change. The pure, resonant tone faltered, souring into a discordant, grating screech. A deep tremor ran through the ground, shaking loose dirt and rock from the tunnel ceiling. Lena stared at her scanner, her eyes wide. The energy field is destabilizing, she breathed. It's growing out of control. Above them, on the surface, the beautiful, silent process turned monstrous. The nascent crystalline forms growing in the plaza began to warp, the perfect geometric patterns twisting into cancerous, jagged shapes. The human-shaped statues cracked and shattered, not into dust, but into grotesque parodies of themselves, all sharp angles and broken facets. The very ground buckled as the energy feedback loop caused a catastrophic failure. A section of the plaza collapsed with a deafening roar, swallowing the malformed crystals into a newly formed chasm. Down in the tunnel, thrown to the ground by the shockwave, covered in dust and grime. Eris and her small band of saboteurs felt the first, tiny, savage thrill of victory. They hadn't built a weapon. They hadn't killed a single enemy. They had simply introduced a flaw. They had taken the architect's perfect equation and scribbled a chaotic, human variable into the margins. It was a minuscule act of defiance in the face of planetary extinction, but as they scrambled back through the darkness, the discordant screech of the failing conversion hub echoing behind them, it felt like the roar of a nascent god. The architects had shown them the end of the world, and Eris Thorne, the quiet historian, had just written its first revision. The silence that followed their return to the archives was heavier than the one the architects had imposed upon the city. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of adrenaline's aftermath, tinged with the metallic scent of fear and the grime of the city's guts. They had won, if such a word could be applied to their desperate act of chemical vandalism. But the victory felt hollow, a single stone thrown against a tidal wave. For 2 days, they barely spoke, each retreating into their own private fortress of exhaustion and dread. Eris lost herself in the archives, pulling down schematics of city infrastructure, geological surveys, and obscure military treatises on insurgency. She wasn't looking for a plan. She was looking for a language, a way to comprehend the scale of their enemy and the nature of the war she had just declared. Call methodically cleaned their gear, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he disassembled and oiled the manual drill, his silence a stoic ritual. Marcus reinforced the archive's entrances, piling priceless card catalogs and oak reading tables against the massive bronze doors, a symbolic and futile gesture that seemed to give him comfort. Lena, however, did not rest. She became a high priestess of the machine, her temple the archive's server room. She had cannibalized every device she could find, creating a monstrous listening post that monitored the subtle energy fluctuations the architects left in their wake. It was on the third day that she called them, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. "It's adapted," she said, her face illuminated by the green glow of a monitor displaying a complex, shifting energy map of the city. The hum. It's different. The omnipresent, citywide thrum was gone. In its place, Lena's map showed localized, intensely powerful pockets of energy concentrated around the major conversion sites. The area of their sabotage, the former plaza, was a dead zone, a hole in the network, but all around it. The other hubs were glowing brighter, humming louder. They've quarantined the wound. Eris breathed, staring at the screen. They learned. They identified the contaminant, isolated the failure, and reinforced the other sites. They're like an organism developing an immune response. The true nature of that response became visible the following afternoon. From their rooftop perch, they watched a new phenomenon unfold in the crystalline forest that was once Central Park. It wasn't a dust cloud, and it wasn't a quiet assimilation. A new structure had formed. A great, floating shard of obsidian-like crystal, easily 100 feet long, that hovered silently above the transformed trees. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and from its underside, it projected a cone of shimmering, heatless light. Where the light touched the ground, everything the delicate crystal trees, the obsidian pathways, the very soil itself did not change. It was erased. It dissolved into a fine, gray, utterly sterile ash, leaving behind a perfectly smooth, cauterized scar on the landscape. They watched as the floating shard methodically moved across a section of the park that bordered an untransformed neighborhood, creating a perfect, dead fire break. "A purifier," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not building anything. It's erasing. It's cleaning up the mess." Eris felt a cold dread snake up her spine. They had shown the architects that humanity was an impurity, a contamination, and the architects, in their silent, terrifying logic, had deployed the solution, an absolute sterilizing agent. Their poison was no longer a weapon, it was a justification for their own eradication. The old tactic was obsolete. They couldn't just throw corrosive chemicals at the problem anymore. The purifiers would simply erase the corruption and the corrupted along with it. Their window of opportunity, the initial chaos of the invasion, was closing. The architects were learning, fortifying, and now cleansing. A new strategy was needed, one more insidious, more fundamental. "If we can't poison the process," Eris said, her voice barely a whisper as she stared at the distant, floating purifier, "we have to poison the ingredients." Her team looked at her, their faces etched with confusion. "They're not importing materials," she elaborated, turning from the window, her mind igniting with the desperate spark of a new idea. "They are using earth, our rock, our water, our metals. They are building their new world from the bones of ours. What if we could contaminate a primary resource, something so fundamental to their construction that they wouldn't detect it until it's already integrated into their systems? Not a chemical that causes a violent, immediate reaction, but something that introduces a latent, systemic flaw. A Trojan horse buried in the foundations." Lena's eyes widened. "You want to infect the bedrock." "Precisely. We need to find a massive, concentrated deposit of a raw material and introduce a contaminant that is subtle, self-replicating, and designed to break down crystalline structures from within. The search began in the Geological Archives, a section of the library Eris had never had cause to visit, poring over dusty mineralogical surveys from the early 20th century. Cale found it a massive, deep earth salt deposit, a relic of an ancient sea, located in a bedrock fault line that ran directly beneath the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Salt, a crystalline mineral, a fundamental component in countless biological and chemical processes. To the architects, it would be a pristine, easily assimilated building block. "I know the access point," Cale said, his thick finger tracing a line on the faded map. "An old pneumatic transit tunnel, abandoned in the 1890s. It was sealed off, but it runs right alongside the deposit. It's deep. Deeper than the subways. Deeper than anything they've transformed up top." The question of the contaminant was harder. A simple chemical wouldn't do. They needed a catalyst, something that would spread. Eris found the answer in the archive's most secure section, the Special Collections Vault, a climate-controlled sub-basement where the world's most fragile and dangerous historical artifacts were stored. Behind a lead-lined door, in a refrigerated container, was a collection of scientific curiosities from a defunct university. Among them were sealed, inert biological samples. Her eyes fell upon a series of vials labeled Halobacterium halobium archcrxt extremophiles, bacteria cultured from samples taken from a deep ocean volcanic vent, organisms designed by evolution to thrive in conditions of extreme temperature, pressure, and salinity. More importantly, these specific strains had been studied for their unique ability to metabolize mineral compounds, to literally eat rock. They were bio-corrosive agents. It was a monstrous idea. They were about to unleash a plague, not on people, but on the very substance of the world the architects were creating. The moral line they were about to cross was terrifying, but the alternative, a slow, silent conversion into crystal or a quick, absolute dissolution into ash, was unthinkable. The journey to the pneumatic tunnel was their most perilous yet. Kyle led them through a section of the underbelly that passed directly beneath an active conversion zone. The hum was a physical presence here, a bone-jarring vibration that made their teeth ache. Through cracks in the tunnel ceiling, the prismatic light of the transformed world above cast eerie, shifting patterns on the damp walls. At one point, Lena's scanner shrieked a warning. "Purifier," she hissed, pointing up, directly overhead. "It's moving slow." They froze, pressing themselves into the shadows of the ancient brickwork. The hum intensified, and a fine gray ash began to drift down through the cracks, dusting their shoulders like a morbid snowfall. They could feel the sterilizing energy field above them, a palpable wrongness in the air that felt like standing too close to a high-voltage line. They held their breath, a silent, terrified prayer passing between them until the hum receded and the ash fall ceased. The purifier had passed. They were beneath its notice, insects in the walls of a house being demolished. The entrance to the pneumatic tunnel was exactly as the archives described, a circular iron plate sealed into a concrete wall, covered in a century of grime. It took Kyle and Marcus the better part of an hour with a crowbar and a sledgehammer to break the seal. The air that rushed out was stale and dead, the smell of a tomb. They descended into absolute blackness, their flashlight beams cutting narrow cones through a space that had not seen light since the age of gas lamps. The tunnel was small, barely 5 feet in diameter, and they had to move in a crouch. After what felt like miles, The tunnel opened into a vast, natural cavern. The walls weren't brick or concrete, but glittering, crystalline salt. They had reached the deposit. It was beautiful in its own way. The raw, chaotic beauty of geology, a stark contrast to the sterile, geometric perfection being imposed on the world above. This was the architect's pantry. Lena took energy readings. "It's active," she whispered. "The hum is present, but it's faint. It feels like they're drawing from it, siphoning minerals in a low-level, steady stream." Eris produced the canister containing the bacterial vials. Her hands trembled slightly as she handled the sample injector, a device borrowed from the Archive's preservation lab. This was it, the point of no return. She was no longer a historian studying the savagery of desperate men. She was becoming one of them. She was about to commit an act of biological warfare against an alien world being built in her own backyard. With Kyle's help, she drilled a deep hole into the salt face. The air filled with the sharp, clean scent of brine. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and injected the contents of the vials deep into the salt deposit. The dormant, freeze-dried bacteria, now introduced to their ideal environment of high salinity and geothermal heat, would awaken. They would begin to feed, to multiply, to spread through the salt deposit like an invisible cancer. There was no explosion, no immediate, gratifying feedback. There was only the quiet hiss of the injector, the click of the empty vial, and the oppressive, humming silence of the deep earth. They had planted their seed of corruption. They sealed the hole, packed their gear, and began the long, silent trek back to the surface world. They didn't know if their plan had worked, or how long it would take to manifest. They didn't know if the architects would detect the microscopic flaw before it was too late. They had released a plague into the foundation of their enemy's world, a self-replicating poison that, if it worked, would not just create a flaw, but would become a part of the system itself, a ghost in the machine that would eat it from the inside out. As they climbed out of the darkness, leaving the tomb of the past behind, Iris felt a profound and terrifying shift within herself. Hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. All that was left was the cold, patient, and utterly ruthless calculus of a disease fighting for the survival of its host. The world they returned to felt different, charged with a new and predatory tension. The architect's initial phase of silent, beautiful assimilation was over. The purifiers now patrolled the skies with unnerving regularity, their silent, erasing beams sweeping across the city, not just creating fire breaks, but actively hunting. The crystalline structures, once static and serene, had begun to change. Fine, shimmering filaments, like a spider's web made of spun glass, now connected the taller structures, creating a network that pulsed with a soft, internal light. The city was no longer just being transformed, it was being wired. "They're building a nervous system," Lena whispered as they watched from a concealed ventilation shaft on the archive's roof. Her scanner, now a permanent appendage, beeped erratically. The energy flow isn't just localized to the conversion hubs anymore. It's being distributed, networked. Whatever they're building, it's coming online. Their act of sabotage felt distant, a hypothetical victory in a war that was escalating with terrifying speed. For a week, they saw no sign that their microscopic plague was having any effect. The purifiers continued their methodical cleansing, and the crystalline web grew denser, casting the streets below in a perpetual, eerie twilight, despair began to creep back into the hollows of their exhaustion. They were running low on preserved food, and the archive's water filters were beginning to fail. They were trapped on their stone island, watching a new world being born, a world in which they had no place. The first sign was subtle, easily missed. It came from Lena's scanner. "There's an anomaly," she announced one evening, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. She pointed to a section of her energy map, a newly converted residential district several miles south. "There's a signal repeater in their network here, one of the main nodes connecting this whole quadrant. The energy throughput is fluctuating. It's dropping and spiking in an irregular pattern." It was a tiny thing, a flicker in a machine, the size of a city. But it was the first deviation from the architect's perfect efficiency they had seen since their sabotage. Over the next 48 hours, the flicker became a tremor. Other nodes in the network began to show similar fluctuations. The light pulsing through the crystalline web in that sector of the city began to stutter, its steady rhythm broken by frantic, arrhythmic flashes. Then, they saw it with their own eyes. From the roof, using a powerful telescope from the archive's astronomy collection, they focused on the affected district. A crystalline tower, once a gleaming perfect spire that had been a skyscraper, was showing visible signs of distress. A hairline crack, dark and ugly, marred its translucent surface. As they watched, the crack widened with a faint, grinding sound that carried on the wind. A fine, grayish powder, like powdered salt, trickled from the fissure. The bacteria. Eris breathed, her heart pounding. "It's working." They used the contaminated salt to build that spire. The bacteria are metabolizing the structure from the inside. It's developing osteoporosis. The flaw wasn't a sudden, violent reaction. It was a degenerative disease. The architects had built a part of their perfect world out of infected material, and now it was beginning to crumble. The architect's response was immediate and terrifying. 3 purifiers converged on the decaying spire, but instead of erasing it, they bathed it in a new kind of energy, a brilliant golden light that seemed to reinforce its structure. The cracking slowed, and the energy fluctuations on Lena's map stabilized. "They're performing surgery," Marcus said, his knuckles white as he gripped the telescope. "They're trying to contain the infection." But the infection was not a static contaminant. It was alive. As the purifiers focused their energy on the spire, Lena let out a sharp gasp. "Look at the network," she cried. "While they're reinforcing the spire, the energy drain is causing brownouts in the adjacent nodes. They're diverting power to fight the infection, and it's weakening the rest of the system." Eris saw it then. The opening they had been waiting for. The architects were not omnipotent. They had finite resources, a finite amount of energy to power their global machine. Their own immune response could be turned against them. If they could force the architects to divert more and more power to fight the spreading structural decay, they could weaken the entire network, creating vulnerabilities, blind spots. They could give the monster a fever. "We need more infection sites," Aris declared, her voice ringing with a newfound, savage purpose. "We need to turn our plague into an epidemic." Their new mission was not to destroy, but to infect. Using Kale's knowledge of the Undercity and Lena's energy maps, they identified other fundamental resource deposits, a massive clay bed beneath a former industrial zone, an underground river that fed into the city's water table, a rich vein of iron ore left untouched by human miners. For each, Eris found a corresponding agent of chaos in the archive's vaults. For the clay, a species of mold known for its ability to break down silicate minerals. For the water, a cocktail of oil-based industrial solvents that would subtly alter the water's chemical properties, making it an unstable bonding agent. For the iron, a highly refined, powdered rust accelerant used in art restoration, which would introduce a microscopic but relentless oxidation into the very metal being drawn up and used by the architects. They became phantoms of the deep, moving through forgotten tunnels, drilling into the Earth's crust, and injecting their poisons into the planet's veins. Each mission was a gamble. Twice they were nearly discovered, forced to hide in flooded sewer mains as the ground above was sterilized by a passing purifier. Marcus was badly burned on one excursion, his arm seared by the proximity of a purifier's energy field, the wound an angry, weeping reminder of the power they were taunting. But they were no longer just survivors, they were saboteurs, fighting a new kind of asymmetrical warfare, a war of biology and geology against an enemy of physics and order. The effects were slow, but undeniable. Across the city, the architect's perfect creation began to show signs of a systemic illness. Crystalline structures developed a faint, ugly discoloration, like a bruise on fruit. The obsidian pathways became brittle, cracking under the stress of their own esoteric energies. The hum of the city, once a pure, monolithic tone, was now riddled with discordant notes, the sound of a machine straining under a terrible internal pressure. The architects were forced to react. More and more purifiers were diverted from their patrols to perform constant, energy-intensive repairs. The network, once a vibrant, expanding web, began to retract, its outer edges flickering and dying as power was rerouted to the core. They had given the city a fever, and the fever was working. The victory, however, was a grim one. The world above was becoming a battleground between two invisible forces, the architect's healing light and their own creeping decay. The landscape was a patchwork of perfect, gleaming structures standing next to decaying, cancerous growths. It was a world caught between a sterile rebirth and a slow, rotting death. And they, the last remnants of the old world, were the architects of its disease. The psychological toll was immense. They were living in darkness, covered in the filth of their missions, subsisting on dwindling rations, their only connection to the world a screen showing the slow-motion decay they had unleashed. They were the agents of a planetary gangrene. One night, huddled in the cold server room, listening to the dissonant hum from the city, Kyle spoke for the first time in weeks, his voice a low rumble. "What happens when we win?" he asked, the question hanging in the chilled air. "If we break their machine, what's left? A poison world, a rotting city." Is that a victory? Eris had no answer. She had been so focused on the war, on the tactics of the forgotten partisans and the chemistry of decay, that she hadn't dared to look beyond it. She had unleashed a plague to save humanity, but in doing so, she was rendering the world uninhabitable for both human and architect. They were winning the battle, but they might be losing the planet. It was Lena who broke the silence, her eyes fixed on a new signal that had just appeared on her screen. It was faint, intermittent, and unlike anything she had seen before, it wasn't the powerful, orderly signal of the architects. It was chaotic, weak, and pulsing with what looked like a primitive data stream. It was coming from outside the city. Eris, Lena whispered, her voice trembling. I think someone else is out there, and I think they just saw our fever." Before Eris could process the implications, a new alert flashed on Lena's screen, this one from their own rooftop sensors. It was an audio signal, a sound from the sky. It wasn't the hum of the architects or the silent passing of a purifier. It was a roar, a deep, guttural, combustion-driven roar. Scrambling to the roof, they stared into the bruised, twilight sky. A dark shape was descending through the low-hanging clouds, a brutalist collection of sharp angles and smoking engines, utterly out of place in the silent, crystalline world. It was not an architect vessel. It was crude, asymmetrical, and violently human. As the ship, a patchwork monstrosity of scavenged parts, lowered itself toward a cleared, sterilized area a few blocks away, a new realization dawned on Eris, colder and more terrifying than anything she had felt before. Their acts of sabotage, the spreading disease, the weakening of the network. They hadn't just been fighting the architects. They had been sending up a flare. They had shown the rest of the world that the gods could bleed. And something else, something that had been hiding in the ruins, had seen the blood in the water and had come to join the hunt. The war was not over. It was about to begin. The arrival of the scavenged gunship, a machine that roared and spat smoke in defiant contrast to the silent, sterile world of the architects, was like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond. The ripples spread through the small, exhausted group in the archives, shattering their grim, focused reality. For weeks, they had been the only resistance, ghosts in a dying city. Now, they were not alone, and the knowledge was not as comforting as they might have imagined. The ship, which Kyle grimly nicknamed the Junkyard Dog, settled in a purifier-cleared zone, a dead, flat plain of fused earth. A ramp lowered, and figures emerged. They were not a disciplined military unit. They were a pack, moving with a restless, wary energy. They were armed with a hodgepodge of salvaged pre-invasion weaponry and crude, powerful-looking tools that seemed designed for demolition. Their leader was a tall, gaunt woman with a shaved head and eyes that seemed to have been burned clean of all emotion. She moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, her gaze constantly sweeping their surroundings, assessing not just for threats, but for opportunities. For 3 days, a tense, silent standoff ensued. Eris and her team watched from the archives as the newcomers established a crude, fortified camp around their ship. They seemed uninterested in the crystalline structures, except as cover. They were scavengers, picking at the corpse of a world Eris was trying to poison. "They aren't fighting the architects," Marcus observed, his voice low and suspicious. He was watching them through the telescope, his burned arm held stiffly at his side. "They're looting. They're tearing apart old-world tech from the untransformed buildings on the edge of the dead zone." "They survived," Eris countered, though she shared his unease. "Out there, in whatever's left of the world, they survived." "That means they're either very smart, very strong, or very ruthless." The answer, she suspected, was all three. Communication came on the 4th day. Not by radio. The architect's energy field still made that impossible, but in the most primitive way imaginable. The woman with the shaved head walked out into the open, halfway between her camp and the archives, and waited. It was a challenge, an invitation, and a threat. Eris knew she had to go, leaving Kale and Lena to monitor the network and Marcus to watch their backs. She walked out of the archives for the first time in months. The air of the new world was thin and sterile, carrying the faint, ozonic scent of the architect's power. The silence was absolute. Meeting the woman in the middle of that dead, gray plain felt like a meeting of two tribal chiefs at the end of the world. The woman's name was Valerius. She didn't offer a handshake. Her eyes, a pale, piercing gray, raked over Eris, assessing her clean clothes and unweathered face with a flicker of contempt. "You're the ghost," Valerius said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp, the one making the glass sick. "We've been tracking the decay for weeks from the mountains. Never seen anything like it. Figured whoever was doing it was either dead or hiding. The archives. Smart." "Who are you?" Eris asked, keeping her voice even, betraying none of the fear coiling in her stomach. "We're the ones who didn't stand still and wait to be turned into lawn ornaments," Valerius sneered. "When the dust came, we ran. We went to the places the world forgot the mines, the bunkers, the dead zones where there was nothing worth converting. We waited, we watched, and we learned." What they learned, Eris quickly gathered, was how to profit from the apocalypse. Valerius and her crew, the Carrion, as she called them, were survivors of a different creed. They hadn't fought the architects. They had adapted to their presence. They moved through the pockets of the old world the architects had ignored, scavenging technology, fuel, and weapons, living off the scraps of a dead civilization. The spreading disease Eris had unleashed was, for them, an opportunity. "Your little science experiment is putting them on the defensive," Valerius explained, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "It's forcing them to pull their purifiers back to the cities to run triage. It's leaving their periphery, their resource conduits, exposed. You've created gaps in their fences, and we intend to run right through them." Valerius wanted a partnership. She had the muscle, the mobility, and the firepower. Eris had the weapon, the biological agents that were the only thing proven to hurt the architects. Valerius's plan was brutally simple. She didn't want to poison the planet. She wanted to cripple the architect's power source. Her deep-range scouts had identified the geothermal tap, the main energy conduit the architects were using to power their entire continental grid. It was located in a deep, volcanic caldera several hundred miles away in the mountains. "They've got it shielded," Valerius said, drawing a crude map in the gray ash with the toe of her boot. "And they'll have purifiers guarding it. We can't get close enough to punch through with heavy weapons. But you don't need to punch. You just need to deliver a package. A big one. Something to give their power source a fatal case of indigestion." The moral implications were staggering. Eris had justified her actions as a desperate defense, a way to save humanity. Valerius was asking her to escalate, to aim for a killing blow that could have catastrophic, unforeseen consequences for the entire planet. But what choice did she have? Their own resources were nearly gone. They couldn't sustain their campaign of pinprick infections forever. The Carrion offered a chance to end it. "We'll need your ship to transport the agents," Eris stated, shifting from moralist to strategist. "And we'll need your people to get us to the injection point. But my team directs the operation. We choose the vector. We control the payload." Valerius studied her for a long moment. Then a slow, cold smile spread across her face. "Deal," she said. "Welcome to the war, Doctor." The alliance was a tense marriage of convenience between a scholar and a scavenger, a thinker and a thug. The carrion crew were hard, cynical people, their humanity scoured away by months of brutal survival. They viewed Eris's team with a mixture of suspicion and awe, calling them the witches of the archive. Kyle's quiet strength and Marcus's disciplined vigilance earned a grudging respect, but it was Lena they watched with the most curiosity as she worked with their own rough-and-tumble mechanic to integrate her sensitive scanning equipment into the junkyard dog's crude systems. The payload was Eris's most ambitious and terrifying creation yet. It wasn't just one agent, but a symbiotic cocktail of extremophiles, each engineered in the Archive's lab to be more aggressive, more virulent. One strain was designed to attack the metallic alloys of the conduit itself, another to metabolize the raw geothermal energy, creating a feedback loop of explosive outgassing. It was a geological bomb. The journey to the caldera was a terrifying flight through a broken world. They flew low, using mountain ranges and the husks of dead cities as cover, dodging the few remaining Purifier patrols. From the air, Eris saw the true scale of the Architect's project and the extent of her own plague. Vast swathes of the landscape were a sick, mottled patchwork of perfect crystal and decaying, salt-streaked blight. She saw crystalline forests that were crumbling into dust and obsidian rivers that had cracked, leaking a foul, brackish fluid. She had wounded the planet to save it, and the scars were horrifying. The caldera was a fortress. It was a massive, collapsed volcano, and at its center, shimmering under a dome of pure energy, was the Architect's geothermal tap, a vast, crystalline structure that plunged deep into the earth. 3 purifiers circled it in a constant, silent patrol. The shield is tied to the tap. Lena reported from her station on the gunship's bridge, her voice tense. "If we disrupt the energy flow, the shield should flicker. That's our window." The plan was a mad dive. Valerius would pilot the junkyard dog in a steep, kamikaze-style descent, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible second. The rest of her crew would unleash every weapon they had, not to destroy the purifiers, but to distract them, to draw their fire. In that moment of chaos, Kyle and Marcus, armed with the injection payload, would rappel from the ship, get to the base of the tap, and plant the charge. Eris, watching from the bridge, felt a profound sense of dislocation. The historian had become a bomb maker, the archivist a general. The world of quiet study and patient research was a distant dream. This new world of noise, fire, and savage necessity was her reality now. "Here we go." Valerius grunted, pushing the ship's throttle forward. The junkyard dog screamed toward the earth. Alarms blared as the purifiers detected them, beams of erasing light, silent and absolute, sliced through the air around them. The gunship shuddered as Valerius's crew opened fire with scavenged rockets and railguns, their crude projectiles splashing harmlessly against the purifier's own shields. A gnat spitting at a battleship, but it was enough. For a heartbeat, one of the purifiers diverted its attention, its main energy beam turning on the ship. Lena screamed. Now the shield is fluctuating. Aris watched on the monitor as Kale and Marcus descended into the maelstrom. They were small, insignificant figures against the immense, glowing structure. They landed hard at its base, moving with desperate speed as Valerius pulled the ship up, its engines screaming in protest, a trail of black smoke marking their escape. Kyle operated the drill while Marcus stood guard, firing his assault rifle at shimmering, vaguely humanoid constructs that began to emerge from the walls of the architect's version of antibodies. The drill bit into the crystalline structure. Kale planted the payload, armed it, and gave the signal. As they were pulled back up toward the hovering gunship, a deep, resonant boom, more felt than heard, shook the caldera. The ground trembled. The brilliant light of the geothermal tap flickered violently, then changed color, shifting from a pure white to a sick, chaotic orange. The energy shield collapsed. The circling purifiers, suddenly cut off from their power source, faltered. They began to drift, their lights dimming, like dying animals. One of them, its flight control gone, crashed into the side of the caldera, shattering into a million pieces of dead, black crystal. A chain reaction was beginning. Lena's console lit up with alerts. All across the continent, the crystalline network was going dark. The fever had broken. The nervous system was dead. As the junkyard dog limped away from the dying caldera, leaving a scene of geological chaos behind them, a cheer went up from the carrion crew. They had won. But Eris, watching the lights of the architect's world die on Lena's map, felt no triumph. She felt only a great, terrifying emptiness. She had cut the head off the snake, but the snake's body was the world itself, and she had just injected a poison directly into its heart. The victory was not a clean, cinematic explosion, but a slow, agonizing death rattle that echoed across the continent. The geothermal tap, poisoned at its source, did not simply shut down. It ruptured. The geological bomb Eris had designed worked too well. Deep beneath the earth, the symbiotic bacteria gnawed at the conduit, while the energy metabolizing agents created a catastrophic pressure buildup. The result was a series of deep, subterranean explosions that shuddered through the planet's crust. A drawn-out, internal hemorrhage. The architect's network didn't just go dark, it was starved, then shattered. The crystalline spires, their internal energy matrix gone, became brittle and unstable. For a week, the world was filled with the sound of their collapse, a constant, mournful music of a billion tons of glass grinding itself into dust. The purifiers, their power cut, simply fell from the sky, becoming inert, obsidian monuments to a failed god. The hum that had been the soundtrack to the end of the world was replaced by an unnerving, absolute silence. Valerius and the Carrion celebrated with a savage, unrestrained glee. They had broken the machine, and, to them, that was the end of the story. They saw the decaying world as their kingdom, a vast junkyard ripe for the picking. But Eris and her team, watching from the battered junkyard dog as it limped back toward the skeletal remains of New York, saw a different reality. They had not saved the world. They had merely changed the nature of its death. The plagues they had unleashed were now unchecked. The bio-corrosive agents, no longer countered by the architect's healing energy, began to spread through the planet's geology with terrifying speed. The salt deposits, the clay beds, the water table, their poisons were now systemic, a cancer in the very bones of the earth. The ground itself became unstable. Sinkholes, caused by the crumbling salt deposits, began to swallow entire sections of the dead. Crystalline cities, rivers, contaminated with the industrial solvents, ran thick and black, poisoning the surrounding land. It was a slow-motion, ecological collapse, and they were its authors. "What have we done?" Lena whispered, staring at a satellite image she had managed to patch through. It showed a continent scarred with gray, crumbling decay, a world turning to ash. The vibrant green of the old world was gone. The prismatic sheen of the new world was gone. All that remained was a monochrome wasteland. When they returned to the archives, they found their stone fortress intact, but the city around it was unrecognizable. It was a landscape of gray dust and shattered crystal, a ghost city haunted by the silence of two failed civilizations. The alliance with the Carrion fractured almost immediately. Valerius saw the archives not as a sanctuary, but as the ultimate prize, a treasure trove of old-world knowledge and resources, sealed and protected. "The war is over, Doctor," she said to Eris, her cold smile no longer holding any pretense of partnership. "Now the salvage begins, and you're sitting on the mother lode." The final battle was not fought against a cosmic, alien intelligence, but against the raw, brutal opportunism of human nature. Marcus, Kyle, and the few Carrion members who had developed a grudging loyalty to the witches barricaded the archives, preparing for a siege. It was a pathetic, squalid end to their grand war of liberation, a fight over the last can of beans at the end of the world. Eris, however, refused to let this be the final chapter. The historian in her, the woman who had studied the cycles of collapse and rebirth, saw one last, desperate gambit. The architects were gone, but their technology, the silent, inert crystal, remained. It was a dead machine, but she wondered if it could be rebooted, repurposed. She had spent months learning how to poison it. Now she had to learn how to heal it, or at least, how to control its decay. While the others prepared for Valerius's assault, Aris and Lena retreated to the server room, their last sanctuary of science and reason. They weren't just building, Aris theorized, pacing frantically. They were terraforming, converting this planet into something that suited them. That means their technology has to be adaptable. It has to interface with the native geology, the native biology. On a fundamental level, Lena, her fingers flying across her console, began to analyze the residual energy signatures from the inert crystalline structures. "There are still pathways," she confirmed, her voice filled with a dawning excitement. "The main power is gone, but the microstructures are still there. It's like a brain with no blood flow. The neurons are still connected, but they can't fire." The key, Aris realized, was the plague itself. The extremophiles she had unleashed were now a part of the planetary ecosystem. They were a new, chaotic variable, but they were also a source of energy. The bacteria, as they metabolized the minerals, released minute, bioelectric charges. It was a tiny amount of power, but it was everywhere. "Can you build a bridge?" Aris asked Lena. "Can you create a program, a virus of our own, that teaches the architect's network to draw power from the bacteria to feed on the very disease that's killing it?" It was a fantastically insane idea to turn their weapon of decay into a symbiotic power source, to merge the chaotic, biological corruption with the rigid, geometric order of the alien tech. For 3 days, as the sounds of skirmishes echoed from the barricades outside, Lena coded. She wrote a new kind of language, one that could speak to both the silicon logic of her computers and the crystalline matrix of the architects. It was her masterpiece, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien design. Their target was the central communication spire, the first structure the architects had built, the nexus of their dead nervous system. As Valerius's forces breached the outer defenses of the archives, Eris and Kale made a final, desperate run. Using the last of their energy reserves, they powered up a directional broadcast antenna on the roof, aimed it at the spire, and uploaded Lena's virus. For a long, heart-stopping minute, nothing happened. The gray world remained silent and dead. Valerius and her raiders stormed into the main reading room, their victory assured. Then, a low hum began. It was not the pure, monolithic hum of the architects, but something different. It was softer, more organic, a thrumming that was part machine, part life. A faint, greenish light began to pulse from the central spire, then spread slowly through the dead, crystalline web. The network was coming back online, but it was a new network. It was drawing power from the billions of microscopic bacteria chewing away at the planet's foundations. The effect was immediate. The ground stabilized. The crumbling structures, now fed by this new symbiotic energy, ceased their decay. They didn't heal, but they achieved a state of equilibrium, a scarred and beautiful fusion of geometric crystal and organic blight. The world was no longer dying. It was transforming. Valerius and her crew froze, staring out the shattered windows at the softly glowing city. They had come to conquer a junkyard, and instead, they were witnessing the birth of a new, incomprehensible ecosystem. Their world of savage survival was being overwritten by a world of strange, terrifying symbiosis. Eris walked out to face them, no longer a historian or a general, but something else. The midwife of a new and broken world. She was exhausted, gaunt, and stained with the grime of her war, but her eyes held a fierce, unwavering light. "The salvage is over," she said, her voice quiet but echoing with an undeniable authority. "The world isn't yours to pick apart anymore. It's ours to rebuild." In the end, humanity survived, not by conquering the alien, but by integrating with it, by finding a desperate, chaotic balance in the ruins. The world they inherited was a strange, hybrid place. Cities of glowing, bioluminescent crystals stood scarred but stable, powered by the very plagues that had almost destroyed them. Humanity lived in the pockets of the old world, in places like the archives, slowly learning to interface with the new one. Eris Thorne, the historian, became their guide. She did not teach them of the past, but of the delicate, dangerous present they had created. She taught them that survival wasn't about victory or defeat, but about adaptation, about the terrifying, beautiful, and savage resilience that was humanity's greatest strength and most dangerous flaw. The invasion had ended not with a bang or a whimper, but with a hum, a new, strange, and enduring song of a world that had been pushed to the brink and had come back forever changed.